Imagine losing a loved one to a mystery that haunts your past. Three childhood friends are torn apart by a dark secret that could destroy them all. Get ready for a journey into trust, betrayal, and justice. This is the story of how a simple childhood game turned into a lifelong nightmare. Boston, in the 1970s, was a neighborhood like any other. Jimmy, Sean, and Dave were playing. They were best friends, inseparable, until one afternoon when their carefree innocence was stolen forever. It was a day like any other. The boys had been running around the neighborhood when they decided to etch their names in wet cement. A small act that should have marked the bond of their friendship. Jimmy went first, then Sean. But as Dave bent down to write his name, a dark figure entered their lives. The man, pretending to be a police officer, walked up to them with authority. His voice was calm but menacing. When he found out that Dave didn't live nearby, something changed. He focused on Dave, isolating him from his friends with just a few words. Dave, scared and unsure, complied when the man ordered him into the car. In his mind, the authority of a police officer meant safety, but this man was no cop. Inside the car sat a priest, smiling eerily. For a young boy like Dave, the sight of a priest should have offered reassurance. But in that moment, everything felt wrong. The trust, the authority, the safety, all of it shattered as the car drove off. Jimmy and Sean were left behind, confused and helpless. The days that followed would mark Dave forever. Locked in a dark cellar, subjected to unspeakable abuse, Dave's mind fractured. The symbols of trust and protection, law enforcement and the church, were turned into tools of evil. Dave eventually escaped, returning home to a life that would never be the same. Though he was physically free, his mind remained trapped in that cellar. The trauma from his abduction was like a shadow, following him through the years, silently shaping the man he would become. The police at the time could do little. With no solid leads, no descriptions of the kidnappers, and Dave too traumatized to talk, the case quickly went cold. The neighborhood moved on, but for Dave, life had taken a dark turn. His friends, Jimmy and Sean, grew up too, their bond weakened by time and distance. Yet, even as they tried to forget, that day was burned into all their memories. Fast forward decades later, and the boys had grown into men. Jimmy, once a small-time criminal, had turned his life around for the sake of his daughter, Katie. Jimmy needed control in his life. Katie, his daughter from his first marriage, was his pride and joy, the center of his world. His marriage to his second wife was stable, his love for his two younger daughters genuine, but his protective instincts ran deep. Sean had taken a different path. He became a detective. To Sean, solving crimes wasn't just a job, it was a way of atoning for the past. Now as a cop he could bring justice to others. Sean was emotionally distant. His marriage was falling apart, his wife living far away with their baby. Dave, however, was the one who had suffered the most. The years had not been kind to him. Though he had a family, a wife and a son, the trauma from his childhood never left him. His mental state was fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. One Saturday, Katie told her father she was going out with friends. Jimmy allowed her to go. As she left, she gave him a look that would haunt him forever, a look that said more than words could. "I'll see you later," she said, but that later would never come. That night, Katie met up with her secret boyfriend, Kid. The two of them were planning something big, they were going to run away together to Las Vegas. It was a plan born of youthful rebellion, a desire for freedom. But neither of them knew the tragedy that awaited. Katie and her friends spent the night drinking and dancing at a local bar. Dave was there too. Alone, drinking, watching. He recognized Katie, the daughter of his old friend, but that connection didn't bring him comfort. The night wore on, and while Katie left with her friends, Dave returned home at 3 a.m., covered in blood. His wife was horrified. Dave had a stomach wound and was clearly shaken. When she begged him to go to the hospital, he refused. He told her a story about being attacked by a mugger. Dave said he had fought back, that maybe, just maybe, he had killed the man in self-defense. But his fear wasn't just about the mugger. It was deeper, darker. Dave was terrified, not just of what he had done, but of what he might be capable of. The next day, his wife checked the newspapers for any mention of a dead mugger, but there was nothing. The silence was deafening, and her suspicion grew. Dave's behavior, always erratic, seemed even more unsettling now. But what could she do? She was trapped in her own fears, just like Dave. Meanwhile, the Boston police received a chilling 911 call. A boy had reported finding a car full of blood abandoned on the streets. The boy refused to give his name, but it didn't take long for the police to trace the car. It belonged to Katie. At the same time, Jimmy was growing frantic. Katie hadn't come home, and as the hours passed, his fear turned to dread. He called the parents of her friends, hoping for answers, but learned that Katie had left them at 1 a.m., heading out alone into the night. As the tension built, Katie's boyfriend, Kid, showed up at Jimmy's store with his brother, looking for her. The animosity between Kid and Jimmy was clear. Jimmy had never liked the boy, suspecting him of leading his daughter astray. Coldly, Jimmy told Kid that Katie was attending her sister's communion. But as the hours passed, the truth would come crashing down. The next morning, the quiet streets of Boston were about to be shaken by a grim discovery. As Detective Sean and his partner arrived at the scene of an abandoned car, they were immediately struck by the sheer amount of blood found inside. The car, belonging to Katie, was a chilling sight, the dark crimson stains telling the story of a violent struggle. Sean's instincts as a detective kicked in immediately. He knew what this meant, the blood loss was too severe for Katie to have walked away from this unscathed. Sean's partner, more pragmatic but just as seasoned, laid out a grim hypothesis: Katie had likely been shot. Judging by the blood patterns, Sean speculated that Katie had been wounded, possibly in the shoulder, before fleeing into the nearby field. The detectives expanded their search, and soon their worst fears were confirmed. Katie's body was found in a churchyard, her life extinguished far too early. As a detective, Sean was trained to deal with death. He had seen it countless times on the job. But Katie's murder hit closer to home than any case before. His emotional distance from Jimmy, from Dave, had come back to haunt him. The phone calls from his wife, the silence that stretched between them, mirrored the emotional distance he felt from his friends. For Jimmy, the discovery of Katie's body was the breaking point. He arrived at the scene, desperate for answers, but Sean couldn't give him the one thing he needed: hope. Sean's inability to meet his eyes was all the confirmation Jimmy needed. His daughter was gone. In that moment, the carefully constructed control Jimmy had fought so hard to maintain crumbled. Grief morphed into rage, and a darker, more violent side of Jimmy began to emerge. As Jimmy identified Katie's body at the police station, the sorrow in his eyes was accompanied by something far more dangerous: a thirst for revenge. He recalled the strange look Katie had given him before she left that night, a look that now seemed like a final goodbye. The detectives noted it, but more important to them was another fact that resurfaced: Jimmy's criminal record. 16 years ago, Jimmy had served time for robbery. To the detectives, this was just another piece of the puzzle. As friends and family gathered at Jimmy's home to mourn, Dave and his wife joined them. But the tension between Dave and his wife was palpable. She couldn't shake the feeling that Dave had something to do with Katie's death. After all, Dave had come home covered in blood the same night Katie was murdered. The pieces were starting to come together in her mind. Meanwhile, the police investigation turned up an unusual clue. In Katie's bag, detectives found pamphlets for Las Vegas hotels. This raised new questions. Was Katie planning to leave town? Was she involved with someone who might have wanted her dead? Jimmy had always prided himself on turning his life around for the sake of his children. But now, the murder of Katie had shattered the foundation of his transformation. Jimmy was no longer thinking like a reformed man, he was thinking like the thug he used to be. He wants revenge. The detectives, including Sean, began questioning Katie's friends, and what they learned was shocking. Katie had been planning to run away to Las Vegas with Kid, her secret boyfriend. The discovery of the Vegas pamphlets shifted the investigation into a new direction. The police began digging into Kid's background, trying to understand his connection to Katie's murder. When he learned about Katie's death, his reaction was one of shock and disbelief. Kid had been planning a future with Katie. He admitted to their plans to run away but insisted he had nothing to do with her murder. His alibi? He was asleep during the time of Katie's death. If Kid wasn't the murderer, then who was? Sean's own emotional connection to the case began clouding his judgment. As the police continued their investigation, they couldn't ignore Dave's odd behavior. He had been at the same bar as Katie the night she disappeared, and his hands were covered in wounds when he returned home at 3 a.m. Sean, torn between his loyalty to his old friend and his duty as a detective, had no choice but to investigate Dave further. Dave's evasive answers about his injuries didn't help his case. He claimed he hurt himself on a garbage disposal, but the detectives weren't convinced. There was too much blood, too many inconsistencies in his story. Sean's partner pressed harder, but Dave's wife came to his defense, lying about when Dave came home that night. Dave was on the verge of collapse. One evening, while watching a vampire movie, a fitting metaphor for how he felt inside, Dave finally broke down. He confronted his wife, his voice trembling with anger and fear. "Do you think I killed her?" he asked, the words hanging in the air like a threat. His wife, terrified but resolute, begged him to tell the truth. "If it was just a mugger, why can't you go to the police and clear your name?" In a moment of raw vulnerability, Dave admitted what he had kept hidden for so long. He sobbed as he relived the trauma of his childhood abduction, telling his wife that he had died in that cellar. "The boy who came back was just a shell, a walking corpse. I'm like a vampire," he said, "undead, but not truly alive." Dave could no longer trust his own mind, and in his fractured state, even he began to doubt his innocence. That evening, Dave's emotional breakdown had rattled his wife. As much as she wanted to believe him, there was something in his eyes that terrified her. She had always known Dave was carrying the scars of his childhood abduction, but she hadn't fully understood the extent to which it controlled him. The detectives weren't blind to this psychological unraveling. The blood found in Dave's car couldn't be ignored. 2 types of blood were found, Dave's own, and another that matched Katie's blood type. When confronted with this evidence, Dave said nothing. His silence was deafening, and to the detectives, it screamed guilt. However, a closer look at the evidence revealed a twist. Dave's car hadn't been in his possession the night of the murder. It had been reported missing earlier that week, raising the possibility that someone else had used the car and planted the blood. Sean, ever the meticulous investigator, couldn't ignore this lead. His gut told him that something wasn't right. At the same time, Jimmy was spiraling into his own obsession. He was determined to find Katie's killer, even if it meant taking the law into his own hands. Jimmy's two close friends provide him with crucial information that Dave is the prime suspect. Jimmy's mind quickly begins piecing together the puzzle, and Dave becomes the prime suspect in his eyes. Jimmy speaks with Dave's wife. She reveals to Jimmy that Dave came home covered in blood on the night of Katie's murder. She's terrified that Dave might have done something far worse. She confesses to Jimmy that she no longer trusts Dave and believes he could be responsible for Katie's death. This confession pushes Jimmy over the edge. He assures her that everything will be taken care of, but his words carry a dark and foreboding undertone. Jimmy has made up his mind: if Dave is guilty, he will exact his own form of justice. While Jimmy was quietly preparing to take matters into his own hands, Sean and his partner were exploring another lead. The gun used to kill Katie had been connected to a past robbery. The weapon had been traced back to none other than Just Ray, Kid's father. This connection reignited an old rivalry between Jimmy and Just Ray, a man Jimmy had despised for abandoning his family and betraying him years ago. As the detectives dug deeper, they learned that Just Ray had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. Sean suspected that Jimmy might know more about Just Ray's fate than he had ever let on. This new lead complicated the case. If the gun had once belonged to Just Ray, could it have been passed down to Kid? Or had someone else in the neighborhood gotten their hands on it? The police brought Kid in for another round of questioning. This time, they focused on his relationship with his father and his connection to the murder weapon. Kid, already emotionally drained by Katie's death, insisted that he had never seen his father with a gun. He hadn't spoken to Just Ray in years, but he doesn't believe Just Ray is missing, since he consistently sends them $500 every month. But the detectives were skeptical. For Sean, the gun connection to Just Ray was the key to solving the case. Back at the police station, a new piece of evidence surfaced. The detectives listened again to the 911 call from the boy who had reported Katie's car. Something in the call stood out: the boy had referred to the victim as her, even though the body had been hidden. How did the boy know the victim was female? This detail suggested that the boy was not just a bystander, but someone with intimate knowledge of the crime. As the pieces of the puzzle started coming together, Jimmy was reaching his breaking point. His desire for vengeance had consumed him. That night, he gathered a few of his old thug friends, and together, they took Dave to a bar. There, over drinks, Jimmy tried to extract a confession from Dave. It was a subtle game at first, Jimmy playing the role of concerned friend, Dave playing the role of a man who didn't know how deep in trouble he was. But as the night wore on, the tension between them boiled over. Jimmy, now convinced that Dave had killed Katie, led him to the Mystic River, a place laden with dark memories. Jimmy finally revealed the truth about Just Ray, that he had killed Just Ray years ago and dumped his body in the river. It was a moment of brutal honesty, meant to show Dave just how far Jimmy was willing to go for revenge. Dave, terrified and trapped, tried to explain himself. He admitted that he had seen Katie in the bar before she died, but he insisted that he wasn't the killer. In a moment of desperation, Dave confessed to something else, something far more personal. He claimed to have killed a child molester, not Katie. The truth was that Dave's mind was so fractured by his trauma that he could no longer separate reality from fiction. Jimmy forces Dave to confess, and in a moment of desperation, Dave admits to killing Katie. In his mind, Dave's confession was enough. Jimmy, consumed by rage and heartbreak, took matters into his own hands. He stabbed Dave, then shot him, finally dumping his old friend's body into the same river where he had disposed of Just Ray. The next morning, the detectives received the final piece of the puzzle. Kid had discovered that his younger brother and a friend had taken their father's gun and had been playing with it the night Katie was killed. In a tragic accident, the gun had discharged, killing Katie. Panicked, the boys had hidden her body and fled the scene. Sean, now armed with the truth, sought out Jimmy. He found him wandering the streets, drunk and broken. Sean told him that they had caught the real killers, Kid's brother and his friend, who had confessed to the accidental shooting. Jimmy, upon hearing this, was devastated. He had killed Dave, an innocent man, in a blind rage for a crime he didn't commit. Sean, suspecting what had happened, asked Jimmy when he had last seen Dave. Jimmy's response was cryptic, thanking Sean for finding the real killers but wishing it had been done sooner. Sean knew what this meant: Jimmy had taken the law into his own hands and killed Dave. But there was nothing Sean could do. Justice, in its legal sense, was out of reach now. Before they parted, Sean asked Jimmy a final, chilling question: would he start sending $500 a month to Dave's family, just like he had done after killing Just Ray? It was a question meant to remind Jimmy of the cycle of violence he had perpetuated. Jimmy, broken and remorseful, walked away without answering. The annual Boston parade rolled through the streets, a stark contrast to the darkness that had gripped the lives of Jimmy, Sean, and Dave. Sean, reunited with his family, stood on one side of the street, watching the parade pass by. Across from him stood Jimmy, a shadow of the man he once was, his wife by his side. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Sean made a gesture, a silent gun pointed in Jimmy's direction. It was a reminder that no matter how much Jimmy tried to escape, the consequences of his actions would one day catch up to him. The names of Jimmy, Sean, and Dave remained etched into the sidewalk where they had once played as children, a haunting reminder of the innocence they had lost. But now, those names carried the weight of betrayal, loss, and violence. The case had been solved, but the damage was irreparable. The tragedy wasn't just in Katie's death, it was in the unraveling of 3 lives bound by trauma. Jimmy's quest for control had led him down a path of destruction. Sean, though he had found the truth, was left with the bitter knowledge that justice, in the end, had come too late. And Dave, the boy who had once been taken, had been lost long before his body was thrown into the Mystic River.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe for more content like this. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. And if you're ready for the next story, go ahead and click on the next video. See you there.